author and the book that we're going to be considering today fits into a description of the purpose of the library book talks that I've often articulated in the past. That is, if there's an important book of Jewish interest out there, something we want to draw people's attention to, something that can teach us, then we want to make sure that it's part of our programming. And that is indeed the fact today. When the book was first drawn to my attention with its name, Forgotten Genocides, Khurbm, 1914 and 1922, Prelude to the Holocaust, I said to myself, well, I don't know very much about that. And I'm pretty knowledgeable in the ups and downs of Jewish history. So if I don't, I'm sure there are others who don't as well. And it would be wonderful to invite the author to share with us the immensity of historical detail and insight so that we can all be educated. And that is why we are here today. The text on the jacket cover does as good a job as I could do in describing both the book and the author. So if you'll permit me a minute to read it, and then I will add a little bit to that. During the First World War, as part of its strategy against Kaiser's Germany and to maintain itself as a unified empire, Tsarist Russia had begun the undeclared war against its Jewish subjects. The atrocities committed by the Russian army, successfully hidden at that time from the Russian and Western public and now almost forgotten, are increasingly recognized as the first step on the way to the Holocaust, the extermination of 2/3 of Europe's Jewry during the Second World War. This book is the first in the Center for Jewish Life Studies projected series on the destruction, Yiddish Khurbm, of Jewish life in Eastern Europe during the 8 years that follows. It makes available to English readers the largest, most extensive collection of surviving eyewitness testimonies which have reached us, as well as anti-Jewish orders and documents issued by the Russian Imperial Army during the genocide. It's exactly what you will find in this book. I would only add to that one of the generosities of this book is that the appendix is actually more voluminous than the text that synthesizes the material from the appendix. The appendix is filled with original documents translated to English, which for someone like me, and I'm sure this includes many of you, we want to get back to the original sources. We want to understand how the author arrived at his conclusions and, be able to evaluate the past from the first articulation of it. And that you will find in this book in abundance. Alexander Gendler is a former NPR Morning Edition commentator, a columnist, contributing writer to a variety of places, including the New York Times, as pieces have appeared on the op-ed page, editor-in-chief of the Forgotten Genocide Project, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Life Studies. Let me ask you, before I highlight the author, to please keep yourselves on mute. I will be careful if somebody strays off of mute during the presentation to find you and mute you myself. There will be presentation and there will be time toward the end of the hour for questions and the like. Please put your questions in chat so that I can keep track of them. And if there's overlap or if there's some choice that needs to be made on account of timing, I can make some selections and share your questions or your comments with the author. So with that, I will highlight, or spotlight, I guess is what they call here. I'll spotlight Alexander Gendler. And Alexander, the screen and the voice is yours.
David, thank you very much for inviting me to speak about the content of my book. I want to also say thank you to all the people that have come. There's now more than 140 people I see are participating in this discussion. And I want to thank you very much for your time and for your attention, because talking about death is not an easy thing. In less than 3 weeks from now, on January 27th, speeches much better than mine are going to be made marking the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today, we're going to remember the genocide that paved the way to the Holocaust. This is what my book is about. Everybody sees it?
Yes, we do. It's on screen.
Sorry. If you ask almost any intelligent and knowledgeable person, what would be the first genocide of 20th century? Most of people will say Armenian genocide of 1915, 1918 in Ottoman Turkey. I'll have to disagree. Unlike Armenian genocide, the first and now almost forgotten genocide is not mentioned in any official documents, but it unfolded 8 months before the Armenian genocide. Today, we're going to continue to call it using the same term that was used at that time 100 years ago, Khurbm in Yiddish, which means destruction. This is what this book is all about. I've given the way the events of our world today are developing in this country and the world. It may unfortunately be a very important book to read. Writing about the events of that time in 1918, Shimon Dubnov, the way Americans say it, one of the most distinguished Jewish historians, said about this event this: at the beginning of the World War, horrors upon horrors were perpetrated before which the ancient annals of Jewish martyrdom fade into insignificance. What was he talking about? Doesn't he know about Khmelnytsky? Doesn't he know about 2 destroyed temples? Doesn't he know about crusades and Inquisition and Spain and everything else? Why is he saying that all of it fade into insignificance? Here's what Simeon Dubnov meant. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, and that same afternoon, Russia responded with declaration of war on Germany and its allies, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria, and a bit later, Ottoman Empire. However, Russia decided to fight the war not only with these countries, but also with its own Jewish people, starting with the Jews in Russian Poland. Here's the front line in Russian Poland between Germany, that is at the end of 1914, when Germany already moved east a little bit. You'll see here on the Russian side, there's deportations, but also these things are marking pogroms of Jews in this part of Poland that were taking place. On the German side, there's not a single pogrom because Germany at that time, in 1914, fancied it that Russian Jews will become a 5th column for Russian Empire and Germany's allies. Nothing like this, of course, happened. Many people were, of course, favorably disposed toward Germany but for a variety of reasons, but very few Jews betrayed Russia. In fact, more than 350,000, by some estimates, 500,000 Jews were serving in Russian army. And many of them sacrificed themselves in a way that today, looking at it, is just simply unimaginable. Many young people came back from America to enroll as volunteers in Russian army. As you see here, this news of what was going on already, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit here. So what we see here, and the first deportation was in Yanovce, right here. Yanovce, Nova Alexandria, Irina, it's Lublin, Irina, Lublin, and Nova Alexandria, Lublin province, Yanovce, Radom, and all of these Jews very quickly throughout the whole Russian Poland were being expelled from their homes and told to leave, where they were given an option: go to Warsaw or go to eastern parts of Pale of Settlement. The orders were accompanied by vicious treatment of Jews, killings, beatings, in order to get Jews out of their houses and get them moving. Very quickly, they turned into mass murders. And in New York, because where people did get information from Poland about what was taking place there were massive demonstrations taking place. Now, English press was not in America, was not reporting it because of a little group organized by Samuel Harper, a son of the first University of Chicago president, and his several helpers, including the American ambassador in Russia. They made sure that no news of it would get into English press. And we know that Samuel Harper, as a founder of Russian studies in the United States, at that time carried a big and important aura of authority. He was telling all these papers that this is all lies, this is all nonsense, it's German propaganda. And newspapers listen, and very little of this, what we're talking about now, ended up in English press. But in Yiddish press was filled with letters from Jews of Russia and Poland. Well, Poland was part of Russia at that time. And that's what caused this demonstration and other demonstrations. In fact, these demonstrations led to many pro-Zionist initiatives, large pro-Zionist initiatives in the United States, and such thing as establishment of American Jewish Congress in 1918. I mean, but the push came from 1914 demonstrations like this. 5 years ago, in 2016, I attended in New York a conference organized by EVA. The name of that conference was A Forgotten Genocide, the Pogroms in Ukraine, 1918-1919. I spent my money on an airplane ticket, paid my $10 to get in. I was not 65 yet at that time. And this particular thing made me dig. Now, you notice that it talks about 1918, 1919, the pogroms in Ukraine. That is a forgotten genocide. And what we're talking about today is something that in American scholarship is not recognized because of a number of different people that made a decision that based on what they found before revolution, Tsar's government was not actively organizing anti-Jewish pogroms. Now, I will defer with those people, and you probably know many of them. Yes, Tsar did not organize pogroms. He did not have to. He passed the laws in 1882, May laws, that basically placed the blame for all the problems, for all the economic problems of Russian peasants on Jews, and expelled many, many, many Jews from rural areas where they lived, pointing to Jews as the problem, and thus enabling and motivating continuation of those pogroms through 1883. And then when the revolution came in 1905, well, of course, there was also Kishinev pogrom in 1903, but then the revolution came in 1905 when 3,500 or more Jews were murdered in pogroms, and more than 600 pogroms. Now, Tsar did not want those pogroms, right? Nobody wants disturbances in their own countries. But if to take side between pogromers organized by Chernosotinцы, that is the Union of Russian People, member of which was Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsar of the time, and the Jews, the police and everybody else will take the side of the pogromers. In any case, so I start digging, and the result is this book, and you can purchase it on Amazon. And if you do not have money, drop me a note at chicagojewishcafe@gmail.com, and I'll email you free e-copy of the book. The expulsions that we're talking about that began in Russian Poland actually took place all along the front line, And they, of course, if policeman comes to a Jewish home and tells them within 24 hours, you need to leave your home, a Jew may leave or may not leave, or he may resist, or he may go complain to some authorities at that time that still existed. But authority, of course, is policeman. So what do you do? In order to speed up the deportation and the expulsions, the local authorities would call on local Christians, neighbors, and would try to make them help to get rid of Jews from those localities. And then when the army, because the army was stationed all along the line, the first pogroms would take place precisely in order to Brody. This is the place which many people that came to the United States crossed in order to get to Germany and then to the United States. And that was the place where the first pogrom took place in 1914. And then, of course, these pogroms spread all along front line. That is, making sure the Jews listened to local police and leave their homes. Where to, they were not told. You could go anywhere. You know, some rich people that had some horses and wagons, they would be, this is a rare photo of such person, you know, this is a rich guy. Now, we do not know what is going to happen to him once he's going to cross this piece of forest or valley. Maybe there's going to be a bunch of Cossacks that are just going to grab everything that he has and maybe take even a horse, although his horse does not look like a horse that Cossacks can use. So they'll just grab him, beat him, you know. If there's one of these two women is a young woman, they're going to rape her. Now, some people were living on horses like this, you see. So you have a wagon and you do not take any food, you do not take any things, but you take your family and you move with them. But most of the people, and this is how some of the people made, you know, leave, you know, Cossacks getting them, but most of the people were on foot. They had no money. They had no horses. They had no wagons. They were moving on foot. Where? We do not know. By the end of 1914, more than 80,000 of these expellees ended up sleeping on the streets of Warsaw. That is by the end of 1914. 1915 is getting worse. This is a little bit better map, clear map of Brody and the movement of different groups of Jews and movement of Jewish expellees. Now, some of them you can call refugees because of the horrors they have witnessed at the places from which they were expelled. But most of them were expellees. That is, the local police would come or the Cossacks would visit. And when Cossacks are coming, then what you see beatings of men, killings, rape of women. Here's a good picture of that depicts the situation when Cossacks are coming. And this is one of the results of these attacks by Cossacks. And this is result of this attack by Cossacks, but we're going to talk about it a little bit later. Right now, we're going to be talking about only the expulsions. And the biggest, most massive expulsion took place, a single expulsion took place in May 5, 1915. That is, in addition to more than 100,000, let me make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So you can read it. It says, in addition to more than 100,000 already expelled Jews of Russian Poland, Tsar Nicholas II army ordered the expulsion by this date, on May 5th, of more than 200,000 Jews residing in the west of Kovna, Yana, Vilkomir, Rogovo, Panevesh, Pasvoli, Salati, Bausk, line towns. More expulsions were to follow. Altogether, by May 5, 200,000 Jews have been kicked out from their homes and expelled. Now, most of them had to make it on foot, but some of them were offered a transportation. That is, those that did not have the ability to move at all. Now,
Alexander, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's, as you're showing these images, so one of the viewers asked, where does this artwork come from? I think it's important for you to let people know as you're showing this.
Absolutely. Thank you. The artwork comes from a pen of a man called Abel Pan. These images are now in Jerusalem. They have been placed in Jerusalem by him. He became a teacher there. He started drawing these images from Kishinev pogrom in 1903. And in 1915, although he was from Russian Poland, but he also, on the Austrian side, was able to get inside and interview all the expellees about these things. And he was very familiar with the situation, with the location, with things the way they were there. And this is the result. By the way, talking about this thing, here's something that I think, would be useful to know. And that is besides recommendation of his drawings that were made by this man, Dr. Hirschberg Hayes. He was a chief rabbi of Vienna until 27, when he died. But in 1926, talking about these images, he said the images are to stir the conscience. So the world lets Israel live in peace and security, contributing to its own and humanity's further development. I have to say that for me, I share this sentiment. I'm not doing it in order to accuse current Russia for the crime Russians committed 100 years ago. I'm doing it in order for us to remember what took place and not to forget, because it's very easy to forget. You know, when I asked one of the great Yiddish scholars in the United States, probably one of the leading, and I asked him, why do you think it was forgotten? His answer was, why? Because after this, there was Holocaust, much bigger thing. And I showed him what this Dr. Hirschberg Hayes said. And he said this in 1926. Humanity has a short memory. Who today, that is in 1926, not in 2020, 21, humanity has a short memory. Who today still speaks of the atrocities committed by the Russian Tsar, of the pogroms, or of the pogroms in 1919 Ukraine? You see, he's talking about here atrocities committed by the Russian Tsar. He was talking about these particular things that we're talking about with you today. And then he goes on, Abel Pan's drawings located now in Jerusalem are not meant to be cruel, etc., 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 but reminders of the blood spilled by our people on the road from exile back home. In any case, back to expulsions. So what you see here largely women and children, sometimes old people, but old people, you know, by the time they get to whatever destination in Yekaterinslavo or some other eastern Pale settlement provinces, they'd be all dead. I mean, the IKAPO, a Russian Jewish organization that was the only one that was helping these expellees, you know, along the road, because the treatment from non-Jews was just horrible to incredible, heartless, horrible, complete indifference. The trains, you know, here, there, in open, shown in open train, cargo train, but many of them were moving in closed trains, and the guards along the way would not open the door for days, sometimes for weeks, with many people just dying there, you know, without food, in horrible conditions, you know, and from diseases. The typhus was very common at that time in Russia. In any case, so here we're talking about, we're seeing only women in this. And the reason for it is because all men, all Jewish men, well, between 15 and 45 were drafted into the army. As I said, the estimate is that anywhere between 350 to 500,000 Jewish men served in Tsarist army during the war. That would make, percentage-wise, Jewish participation on Tsar's side, the highest of any ethnic group in Russia. Now, I said that it was August 1st, 1914. August 1st, 1914 was the Tisha B'Av of that year. I do not know if it means anything, but the horrific things that took place afterwards cannot be separated from that day. And unlike Armenian genocide, which is marked by Armenians today, April 24th, because on April 24th, 1915, about 200 Armenians were rounded up and placed in detention centers, of which where many of them, if not majority, perished, died. And then, of course, followed massive Armenian deportations from East Anatolia. Here, the expulsions and killings of Jews began 8 months before that. The pattern of expulsion was everywhere approximately the same. In the morning, military guards would go to Jewish homes to announce that all Jews must leave within 3 hours. Sometimes they would be given 24 hours. In case of Kovna, that is May 5th deportation, they were given 3 days. Regardless whether people in-house were old, sick, pregnant, young mothers with nursing babies, they could take with them whatever they could carry, mostly food, and moved either toward Warsaw, Riga sometimes they moved, or if they had some way of moving east, they would move using wagons or walk. If they did not have any money at all or not ability, they would be put on these freight trains that, as you see, looked like, well, maybe differently, like trains 20 years after, 30 years after. In any case, if they all along the road, the soldiers would mock the Jews. The Polish mobs would scream, "Go to your Palestine, go to Beilis." Beilis, that is a trial of Beilis in 1912 that was made by Russia blood libel of Jews in Kiev. During the march, children and older people got trampled very often. At no point during this ordeal, the people were allowed to stop or rest. And when they got to some city, Warsaw or Minsk or some other thing, they would end up wallowing in disease-infested shelters for homeless, if there were such, or mostly on the street. In middle of April of 1915, the front lines in the Baltic shifted, and they were shifting back and forth. And when Germans would leave, even greater horrors would begin. I mean, the German occupation was not a candy, but when they left, even greater horrors began. The Jewish neighbors and local peasants would pillage their properties. Men would be beaten. Many women were raped. I have to say that according to Dubnov, and this is very important, he says that almost no Jewish woman escaped being raped from the population along the front line. And I have to say, of 5.5 million Jews who lived in Russia at that time, 70% lived along the front line. In many towns, Jews were shot, tortured, humiliated in front of their relatives. And for them, expulsion then felt like salvation. Using the defeat of Russian soldiers, Russian army fabricated lies around the village of Khurbm, which said that because of Jews, Russian army suffered failures and defeats. All Russian newspapers were made to publish this fake news about so-called Jewish treachery in Khurbm. It became the news in Russia at that time. The fabrication was used, that was the fabrication that was used as justification for Russia's criminal order to deport all Jews of Khurbm and Khurbm, that is Latvia provinces. Mind you, I'm sorry, seems like time is going. Mind you, that this was the very same time when Russia and its allies, France and Germany, were denouncing Ottoman deportations of Armenians as a crime against humanity. Precisely that time. They said it on May 24th. And here, deportations and murder of Jews of these provinces is taking place on May 5th. Let me get to this point. Now, according to information from IKAPO, that is Jewish organization, that was helping along the road to refugees, and they were not helping all. The memoirs of French ambassador in Russia say that more than in September of 1915, he says, in July, he says 600,000 Jews have been deported. And in September 1915, he says 800,000 Jews have been deported. Now, he's talking only about Russian Jews, but Jews in Galicia, that is, which was before they were part of Austria, also suffered horribly. You know, anybody can read Ansky and some other documents, and more than 400,000 have been kicked out of Galicia. There was about 1 million Jews living, maybe a little bit more than 1 million Jews living in Galicia. 40% of them have been kicked out. Many of them ended up in Vienna and in other parts of Austria, but during the deportation, many of them died. So this EKAPO, Russian Jewish organization that was helping Jews, estimates that about 10% of expellees died from hunger and disease on the way to whatever destination they were going. In reality, there's other sources, the figure would be more than 30%. That is, we're talking about 300,000 Jews that were murdered during these deportations and pogroms in the places just to get them out of their houses. Now, the difference between, we estimate there's about 30 to 40,000 Jews were killed directly in pogroms during this period, 1914, 1915, 1916. That is by Russian army, mostly Cossacks, by Russian army, but mostly Cossacks. There was 400,000 Cossacks in Russian army. So about 30 to 40,000 Jews were murdered in the during the war. Now, it's not as much as 120, 150,000 murdered directly during the 1919 in Ukraine, in Ukrainian pogroms, but the total number of dead would be approximately the same. In Ukrainian pogroms, there was also something like 1 million people that tried to escape those pogroms, and they were murdered right on the road, wherever they tried to escape, in a forest, in the fields, not only in their homes where they could be counted. And Luria, one of the main leading communists in Moscow Communist Party, in 1928 lecture, in 1928, said that according to their estimates, more than 300,000 Jews died during that period as a result of these pogroms. Now, as a result of these deportations, expulsions, and pogroms, we estimate that no less than 300,000 died. The only thing is that the number of who died directly in army stage pogroms is smaller, about 30 to 40,000. Now, once expulsions the funny thing is that with regard to these expulsions from Kovna and from Khurbm, 10 days after the expulsions began, the command of Russian army started changing its mind, and because it felt that, yeah, they wanted to show the whole country that Jews are the problem, but also the country saw this sea of old men, women, and children being treated inhumanely, and that was producing effect not only on the liberal intelligentsia in Petrograd, but also on almost anybody who could see those people. In any case, so that was undermining the morale within Russian society. And like 10 days after expulsion, the Russian command understood its mistake and told the Jews now can come back. Here's what one picture of them coming back looks like. This is what they came back for, because their neighbors very often, most of the time, took the property from their homes that remained and burned their houses. So the Jews would not be able to come back. But it seems like these Jews that were able to come back put up from among themselves some people, mostly rich Jews or Jews who were respected by community, and rabbis. They gave them to army because army was taking Jews as hostages in order to guarantee, as they said, the behavior of Jews, the proper behavior of Jews. About 35,000 Jews were taken as hostages by Tsarist army. And of them, they were kept in just absolutely horrible conditions. You know, in my book, you'll find that in some jails, you know, that were designed for 8 cells, jail cells that were designed for 8 people, there was 35 people. That is, they were packed, disease, not disease. They were sleeping one on top of another. And out of the 35,000 that we estimate were taken hostage by Russian army, more than 150 were executed. The most common method was in Russia was hanging. This is, I do not know how the Abel Pan, if we're using the same source, but on December 4th, 12 Jews were taken hostage in Sakhachev of Warsaw province. They were kept under guard, replaced every day with new hostages. And on December 24th, I guess it's a present for Jesus, 3 hostages were executed for unknown reasons. Now, but many of hostages were just simply shot. Now, shooting was normally German method of execution. but Russians were doing it too sometimes. And here, what you see in this picture, you see a rabbi, you see a well-off businessman, you have some regular Jews, maybe, and you see, you know, some what in Russia called intelligente, you know, some maybe revolutionary, maybe not revolutionary, but he looks like the guy that should be shot. It's already time. I'd like to say a few things about the pogroms that took place. That is Russian pogroms that took place, Russian army organized pogroms that took place. I mean, because this is something that needs to be said. And besides blood of men, what took place was just horrific things that were taking place with regard to women. I'm reading from my book. On September 2nd, the German troops entered Smargon. They conducted searches and arrested many people, German troops. They also confiscated leather, cash, and other valuables. After suspecting local Jews of spying, the German commandant took several hostages from among them. You see, Germans also had this thing. That is one reason that when Germans later retreated, Jews celebrated the return of the hostages and went all out to greet Russian troops re-entering the town. Their joy was short-lived, however. Accusations by the locals that the Jews supposedly assisted the Germans caused growing anger among the soldiers. Anticipating trouble, many well-off Jews fled Smargon for Minsk, leaving their property behind. Now, I want to mention here that that year, 1915, Yom Kippur was September 5th. So this thing, these events are taking place around Yom Kippur and right after it. The looting began in the evening of September 7th and continued through the night of September 8th. This is just one of example. Using the excuse that they needed to search a house, soldiers would break into homes, steal valuables, beat men, and rape women in front of their husbands. The Christian neighbors took an active part in this pillage. The reaction on the part of the officials varied. Some officers not only allowed the pillage to continue, but participated in it themselves, while others tried to disperse the crowds and ordered the arrest of pogromщики. A group of about 40 Jewish soldiers, as I said, the Russian army had a lot of Jewish soldiers. A group of about 40 Jewish soldiers, unable to continue restraining themselves, banded together to defend the Jews of Smargon. When the Cossacks inside the synagogue began raping women who sought shelter there, they confronted the Cossacks standing on guard in front of the old synagogue, engaged them in battle. When the Jewish soldiers were finally able to break through and enter the synagogue, what they saw there was a scene from hell. The Cossacks were breaking furniture, ripping Torah scrolls, and desecrating holy objects, while in the middle of the synagogue, there was a pile of corpses of Jewish women who had been raped and then tortured to death. Along the body of one young woman, there lay a chopped up body of her elderly father. The soldiers attacked the Cossacks and the fight spilled into the street. The Cossacks suffered many casualties. 2 of the Jewish soldiers were also killed and many wounded. The military commandant ordered the arrest of all who took part in the fighting and sent them to the front. And here's one. The suffering of Jewish women during this period deserves a special place in martyrology of Russian Jewry. Often just hearing over the approaching Cossacks caused a horrific panic among Jewish women, making them flee. Cossacks attacked women of all ages and showed no pity either for little girls or elderly. As already mentioned, it didn't matter to Cossacks' goons if a particular woman happened to also be the wife of a soldier in the Russian army. The savagery and lack of discrimination on the part of Cossacks was amazing. They didn't care if it was a little girl, a wrinkled old woman, or pregnant and breastfeeding woman. Anyway, many more of such situations in the book. And for now, I think
okay, this is a good, I mean, there's much more to add, but you can hear my voice, right?
yes, I can.
Okay, so I'm going to leave you on screen and let my voice be speaking to you from the background, sharing some of the questions. Just to begin with, several people have asked about how to contact you for a electronic copy of the book. Should I have them just respond to our promotional email and we can send them your email, or do you want to say it's
That would be fine, whatever, but they can also write directly at chicagojewishcafe@gmail.com.
chicagojewishcafe@gmail.com. Okay, great. So if they write you there, you will send them copies.
Right.
Okay, good. We
Electronic
don't have
copy.
electronic copy. Yes.
Yeah, we want money from them, but electronic copies don't cost us anything.
Understood. Berenice, thank you for sharing that on the chat. There are more comments than I will be able to, then we'll have time for, but just to take a few of them quickly. One of our listeners was curious about how your book differs from the book, The Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918 to 21, and the onset of the Holocaust.
I do not know anything about that book or who wrote it. And but I looked through many books dealing with the topic, and some books do mention the events that we're talking about now. But the problem is that even in recently published books, I do not see the word genocide connected to these massacres.
Okay, so maybe you could explain, since you emphasized the word genocide, I think it's the common understanding of genocide is a policy, a program of, going out and intentionally murdering a people as a whole. That's certainly the understanding.
People of a particular ethnic or religious group.
Yes, right.
Organized, commanded from the top.
So what you discovered, was this a policy of murder, or was it a policy of conquest, expulsion, and humiliation that led to many deaths? In other words, is there a difference between what you're describing here and another? Whoever's calling in, please wait till your turn. Go ahead, Alexander.
What we're talking about here is organized murder, specifically of Jews, that was a policy of Russian Imperial Army. Specifically, its point man was the Chief of Staff of Russian Army, Nikolai Yanushkevich, a favorite of Nicholas II. And the policy was designed to cement. Russia had problems, from 1902 especially, when Poles staged a rebellion. Russia had problems with Poland. It was not reliable ally. We know that some of them actually served on the side of Austro-Hungary. But so Russia wanted to please Poles, and Poles, especially the fascists of Dumsky Democratic Party, demanded that Jews would be gotten rid of. They were demanding it from before the war. The Jews should go. They staged boycotts of Jews and everything else. And the Russian army, trying to please Poles, that they were, at least those Poles that were their main allies, had the policy of expelling, deporting Jews, and giving what they called commanding heights in the economy of that area to Poles in Poland and to Ukrainians, West Ukrainians in Galicia. That was the policy. It was exactly the same was with Ottoman Turks with regard to Armenians.
Understood. Okay, thank you. Shelley has an important question. She wants to know whether you have any thoughts on why the Jewish community today does not have an annual day of remembrance for those who died in the pogroms, and what kind of practice you might imagine to honor those who lost their lives and their memory.
This is the reason that I created this website and the Center for Jewish Life Studies. This is something that was remembered 100 years ago, is not remembered at all today. And I have to say that, of course, Holocaust is remembered, well, more in words and by many countries, but it's because Holocaust is Holocaust. The winners in the Second World War, need something to congratulate themselves with. But the problem with the genocide that we're talking about, Khurbm, especially the first genocide, is that the winners in that war were collaborators in the crime. They were allies of Russian Tsar. In France, when you try to talk about it, during when it was taking place, in the United States, as you see, there were demonstrations because the United States was neutral at the time. But France was on the side of Russia, and people who tried to do something about it would be instantly threatened with the jail. In England, they were not threatened with jail, but they were ignored because Russia was a very important ally for England. Now, I have to say that people in England today, talking about it and answering this, Jewish scholars on that area, this is very interesting. When first I asked, is it genocide? The answer was absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, well, it was more like genocidal violence. Playing on words. And in the United States too, there's similar things. Now, and talking about Jews, that is Jewish organization, regardless whether scholars or not scholars, there's a big problem, a really big problem. And that is why this problem needs to be addressed. And that's why this Khurbm needs to be remembered. That is the problem of women's being raped across the entire front line. Now, I understand that they were not young men to defend, and older men were not in position to defend, and on, and there were all kinds of things that were taking place. And people, when the whole Jewish communities were destroyed, people lost all faith, whatever remained in God and everything else, and were doing all kinds of nasty things, behaving also very immorally. But we need to remember it, because things have a tendency to repeat themselves. And, if from a Holocaust staged by Germany, there's not much you can learn because, my God, such a vicious, such a murderous, such an incredible event, is difficult to repeat. But this Khurbm genocide repeats itself as a pattern in all genocides that we know of.
There are other comments and questions, but our time is up. So I'm going to recommend you've given your email. So others who have got questions, can they send them to you via the email? Okay,
Please.
Great. Let me thank everybody for coming for what I hope you found, as I did, a very important educational experience. And as I said earlier, I appreciated very much having the opportunity to read this book with its immense detail and its abundant quotation of original sources. As I said, the library sees its responsibility as sharing with you books of importance for us all to consider. We happen to have another book talk tomorrow night, which is of a very different nature. It is a book of poetry, even mystical poetry, by one of our colleagues, faculty at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Eitan Fishbane, called Embers of Pilgrimage. I invite you to join us then as well. And I wish you all a good 2022. Alexander, thank you so much for your generosity.
David, thank you very much for allowing me to share it.
It's our pleasure. Okay, bye-bye to everybody and good
Bye.
to see you.
Yasher koach. Toda rabah.
Yasher koach gam lecha.